It was that time of year, just after winter, but just before spring. Those few weeks between the last frost and the really warm afternoons, when the bass are just beginning to move. No need to get fancy for the first trip of the season. A few six-packs in the cooler and some crankbaits will do it. Of course, Jake McDermott and his neighbor Rudy rarely had much luck this early in the year, but that didn't really matter. It always felt good just to get out on the lake after what Jake called the long indoor season. As much as anything, it was an excuse to get out of the house, to get away from it all, pop a few beers, and just plain relax. A lousy day of fishing, they both agreed, was still better than a good day at the office. They took their time working the shallows at the south end of the lake during it was slow, but at least their cooler was full. It was only shortly after 2, but Jake was already working on his second six-pack. There was a touch of warmth in the afternoon air, but the water in the lake that day was still a bone-chilling 41 degrees. Jake was saving the best for last, a patch of flooded timber on the far side of the lake. It was natural bass cover, and over the years, he'd taken some nice fish right at the edge of the submerged trees. It was the kind of place that Jake felt was always worth one last cast.
I got one. I got one.
What do you got? What do you got?
Oh, I thought I had one.
You snagged again. Oh, boy. Another tree fish.
Come on, get loose there.
Oh, boy. I gotta go all the way in there and get you unstuck now, or what?
Maybe I can throw it.
Pull on it. Pull hard on it. That'll come loose.
Come on. It's not coming.
Jake McDermott drowned just a few yards from his capsized boat in about 8 feet of water. A tragic accident? Of course, they always are. But a freak accident? Far from it. In fact, everything about Jake McDermott's drowning, from where it happened to what caused it, is typical of the vast majority of fatal boating accidents that happen every year. If that sounds surprising, well, that's part of the problem. You see, contrary to popular belief, the typical accident doesn't involve a large offshore boat floundering in high seas and gale force winds. The circumstances in which most fatal accidents occur are far less dramatic. Instead of big water, the typical accident happens inland, on lakes and rivers, the small ponds and streams. And in more cases than not, it's the non-traditional boater who's involved. Fishermen, hunters, campers, people who are likely to be on the water in the spring or the fall months. And usually it's small boats, 16 feet or less, either with no motor or one of 10 horsepower or less. Almost half of all boating fatalities happen in broad daylight and in flat, calm conditions. And most of the time, the boat isn't even underway. Thanks, Jim. Of course, no two boating accidents are exactly alike, but in all too many cases, the common denominator is alcohol. In fact, 60% of all boating deaths are somehow alcohol-related. Part of the problem is that drinking while boating is almost a tradition. The one item you can bet will be on board is a cooler full of beer. But when out in a boat, the alcohol in just 2 or 3 drinks can significantly affect your balance, your vision, your judgment, and your ability to react quickly in case of an emergency. And don't for a minute fall for the myth that beer or wine is any less intoxicating than hard liquor. A can of beer or a glass of wine contain the same amount of alcohol as a shot of whiskey. It doesn't take much alcohol to affect your coordination, And even the slightest sense of unsteadiness can transform small boats like these into highly unstable and dangerous platforms. Maintaining the stability of a small boat is critical, so it's essential to understand the boat you'll be using. Most modern boats have capacity plates. This 14-foot utility boat is rated for a maximum of 640 pounds and a 25 horsepower motor. However, this flat-bottom boat of nearly the same length has a maximum capacity of only 440 pounds and should be equipped with a motor of no more than 7.5 horsepower. Under no circumstances should a boat be overloaded or overpowered, and a small boat is no place to stand up. If you have to change positions, keep a low profile and keep your weight centered toward the middle of the boat. Falling out of a boat is always an embarrassing and very often an unpleasant experience. But for the boater who's been drinking, an unexpected plunge could prove deadly. It may be hard to believe, but the inebriated person whose head is underwater can become so disoriented as to swim downward to their death rather than to the surface and safety. You know, the real tragedy of practically every boating-related drowning is that it could have been easily prevented. Wearing a personal flotation device, a PFD, is by far the single most important safety measure you can take when boating. It's a point we've been stressing for years and one that simply cannot be overemphasized. Look at it this way. Virtually every single boating-related drowning could be eliminated if the victim had been wearing a PFD. You know, for the most part, small boat safety is simply a matter of being aware of the kind of situations and the kind of behavior that can turn a pleasant day on the water into a needless tragedy. It was a kind of big and wide open lake that every skier dreams of. A place where you could go on skiing for miles and likely never even see another boat. Like many weekend boaters, the Woodsons didn't get out that often. This was only the second time all summer. As much as a skiing or spending time with his family, for Dean Woodson, this was a chance to unwind after a long week behind his desk. Out here on the open water, he didn't have a care in the world. The midday sun felt good. But in this kind of heat, Dean just couldn't seem to get enough to drink. The beer went down like water, and the 7th and then the 8th tasted as good as the first. Dean himself had been a strong skier during his college years, and now he never missed the chance to show off in front of the kids. Like many men his age, he still felt he had to push himself to the limit. But what he didn't realize was that 15 years, 20 pounds, and 8 beers too many had already pushed him well past that limit. They'd been on the lake since just past 8 that morning. It was now after 5, and Dean was beginning to feel a long day. But he had promised Carol a chance to catch a few rays, and the kids a few hours of fishing before heading back in. The Woodsons weren't the only ones hoping to catch a fish that afternoon. About 3 miles away, Gary Albright and Paul Grayson had spent the day drift fishing near the western shore, and now were about ready to call it a day. Dean was already on his way back to the marina, some 15 miles away. Not much of a trip, but it didn't take long for his whole family to conk out, and he wasn't far behind. Gary and Paul weren't tired, but they'd figured they might need some extra time getting back to the dock. Their rented outboard had given them trouble all day, and now it didn't seem to want to start at all. They were beginning to think they might be in trouble until Gary heard the other boat. Well, at least they'd be able to get a tow back in. But with the glare off the water and in his condition, Dean didn't even know they were there. Suddenly, Gary realized that this boat wasn't coming to help. It wasn't slowing down, and it was heading right for them. probably some hotshot playing games. But Dean wasn't up to any stunt. He was, in fact, just barely awake. His boat had become a 2,000-pound projectile, and its target lay dead ahead.
Watch out! Stop! Look out! Look out!
In just the blink of an eye, Dean Woodson's favorite toy came within just a few feet of becoming a deadly missile. Fortunately, with the exception of a few minor cuts and bruises and a bad case of frayed nerves, no one was seriously injured. The people in that boat were not as lucky. A 36-year-old man and his wife were killed, and their 8-year-old daughter seriously injured when a 20-foot day cruiser ran into them at high speed. Collisions, whether they occur with another boat or objects in the water, are far and away the most common type of boating accident. And a surprisingly large number happen not at night or in heavy fog, but when conditions are ideal. So why do so many collisions occur? Well, first of all, it has something to do with the sense of freedom we experience when we're on the water, a feeling that we can go just about anywhere without really having to pay close attention to what we're doing. After all, out here there are no traffic lanes or signals, and the chances of colliding with another boat in all this open space seem incredibly remote. As a result, there's a tendency to take a very casual approach to operating a boat. And that's where the problems start. The number one cause of collision accidents is carelessness, a failure to keep a proper lookout. But there's more to it than that. Out here, your body really takes a pounding. You may not sense it, but the sun, the wind, the glare off the water, in addition to the noise and vibration from your boat, really take a lot out of you. In just a few hours, this kind of exposure to the elements actually induces a kind of boater's hypnosis. It's an overall fatigue combined with a reduction in coordination, reaction time, and even a loss of sharpness of your vision. In fact, Coast Guard tests have shown that the fatigued boater takes twice as long to react and perform correct boating maneuvers as when rested. Now, add a few drinks to an already long day on the water, and you really have a problem. The boater who's been drinking usually takes far more time just to make sense of what he sees happening around him, and then even more time to decide how to react. On top of this, the boater who's been drinking usually develops a false sense of his abilities and often ends up taking risks he would normally avoid when sober. On the water, your eyesight is critical, and alcohol only adds to the problem of already stressed and strained eyes from the sun and the wind and the water. Even if your normal eyesight is excellent, you may find that under these conditions, your peripheral vision or field of view is narrowed, and that you have an increasingly difficult time judging speed and distance and accurately tracking moving objects. What it comes down to is that boating isn't as relaxing and restful as we tend to think it is. Actually, spending a day on the water can be exhausting, especially if we add a few drinks to our outing. The worst part of it is you probably won't realize how tired you are, how sluggish your reactions have become. So at the end of a long day, slow down. Give yourself plenty of room to maneuver when other boats are around, and keep an extra sharp lookout, even if you think you're the only boat on the water. It is a ritual as old as the sport itself. And here out on the open water, you need more than a few dozen decoys. Roy LeGrand had been hunting the river since he was 16, yet for him, there was still something special about watching the sun slowly rise over the water. His partner thought so too. Roy's hunting friends liked to kid him about his fancy duck boat. Sure, it wasn't much larger than a dinghy, but then he only used it to set out the decoys, and for that, it worked just fine. One thing about duck and goose hunting, you never know what's going to happen. But some days the birds come in as if on cue, and this was one of those days. This was Skeeter's first season, and from the looks of it, he had the makings of a fine dog, and no one could have been prouder than Roy. Hunting ducks and geese. As much as anything, it's a game of waiting and watching. And most of the time, you have the feeling that the birds know right where you are. But it was still early in the day, and around noon, a cold front started to push through from the west. With the wind, the sky clouded over, and the temperature began to drop. Just the kind of weather that Roy knew would get the birds stirred up. And it didn't take long. A small flight was coming off the river and looking for a place to come in. It was a good sign, and now Roy knew the bird would really be on the move. The bird fell beyond the outer edge of the decoys. Skeeter couldn't see it, but he knew it was out there, and he was going to get it.
Come on, over.
Roy had picked Skeeter from his last litter of 6 pups and had trained him himself. Skeeter had even gotten to the stage where he would respond to hand signals. But a blind retrieve, and a long one at that, is a real challenge for any dog, and the wind wasn't making it any easier. The bird was hidden in the choppy water and was rapidly being swept out into the strong current of the main channel. Labs may be the closest thing there is to a duck retrieving machine, but Skeeter had now been in near freezing water for more than a few minutes. Too long, even for a strong young lab. He was confused, he was cold, and he was tired. And now, Roy realized that his dog was in trouble. It's funny how quickly we can change our thinking about certain things. Roy had always thought of his boat as really nothing more than a storage bin for his decoys. Yet right now, that little skiff was the one thing that could help save Skeeter's life. Roy knew that lifting a 60-pound lab into a 7-foot boat wasn't going to be easy. But right now, there was no choice. The water was just below 40 degrees, and the instant Roy hit it, it literally took his breath away, and the bitter cold snapped his every sense into a state of shock and confusion. Fortunately, his flotation coat had kept him bobbing like a cork, and he had little trouble getting back to the boat. And the moment he saw Skeeter, Roy was confident that he could make it back in. But the 200 yards he had to paddle back to shore were the most agonizing of his life. Nothing can prepare you for the incredible and instantaneous shock to your system when you're suddenly plunged into near-freezing water. Your first reaction is an involuntary gasp, a torso reflex that can prove deadly if your head is under the water. In addition to the sense of panic and disorientation, your heart and circulatory system undergo a tremendous strain, sometimes resulting in cardiac arrest. Consider that a man, even without clothing, if he stays active, can survive on land at 32 degrees Fahrenheit for as long as 24 hours. But cold water conducts the heat from your body some 25 times faster. Your survival time in near-freezing water is literally a matter of minutes. In fact, drowning is often not the cause of death of many victims who fall into cold water. The killer? Hypothermia, the rapid and drastic chilling of the body core. After getting back into his boat, Roy LeGrand was able to paddle back to the dock. His friend said it must have been his lucky day. But the reasons he came back alive had very little to do with luck. First of all, he was properly dressed for the cold. But the single most important thing he was wearing was a flotation jacket, a PFD, something like this one. By keeping him afloat, he was able to expand all of his rapidly diminishing energy into getting back to his boat and getting out of the water. Wearing a PFD is critically important when boating in cold water, even if you're an Olympic-class swimmer. If you fall in without a PFD, it'll be next to impossible to get one on while in the water. And don't waste your time or energy trying to take off your heavy clothing. They won't drag you down. Because they trap air, they'll actually help you remain afloat and preserve your body heat. In fact, should you capsize or fall overboard in cold water, your every effort should be directed toward just one goal: getting out of the water as quickly as possible. It's a rule Roy LeGrand didn't forget, and it saved his life. He was prepared, and he knew that surviving was entirely up to him. A cold December marsh is no place to expect help to come along. So if you head out when the water is cold, be absolutely sure you're well prepared. Dress properly. Several layers of light clothing offer better protection than a single heavy layer. And remember, wool insulates even when wet. Check the weather forecast and be sure to tell someone where you're going and when you expect to return. Know what to do in an emergency. Practice capsizing and righting your boat during the warm water months. And always wear a PFD. Never forget that water assumes an entirely different character as its temperature drops. From an element that is pleasant and refreshing during the summer, it becomes, as it gets cold, one of the most hostile environments known to man. You know, as I look at the accident reports from around the country, it's frightening to note just how many took place in circumstances where there was no obvious danger. A fisherman casting on a quiet lake, a duck hunter setting out his decoys just a few yards from his blind. The fact is, the vast majority of boating accidents happen without warning, at times when they're least expected. Far too many people who use boats as part of their outdoor recreation simply don't realize how easy it is to get into serious trouble, to actually find themselves in life or death situations. If you don't think so, consider that more outdoorsmen die from drowning or cold water exposure than for any other reason. And in the younger age groups, drowning is the second leading cause of accidental death in the country. So if your outdoor sport involves boats, please take this advice to heart. Take the time to learn basic boat handling skills. Courses are available through your state or provincial agencies, as well as a number of private boating organizations. If you drink, you must understand that alcohol greatly increases your chances of having an accident. If you go out when the water is cold, be prepared and know what to do in case of an emergency. If you can't swim, take a course from your local YMCA or the Red Cross. But no one should ever be embarrassed to wear a PFD. It is by far your best defense against drowning. A few preventative measures, some basic safety rules, and some common sense. Nothing complicated, but it can go a long way towards saving your life.